History as it happens, January 2nd, 2024. Biden's foreign policy, year 4.
Hamas and Putin represent different threats, but they share this in common. They both want to completely annihilate a neighboring democracy, completely annihilate it. Hamas' stated purpose for existing is the destruction of the state of Israel and the murder of Jewish people. Hamas does not represent the Palestinian people. Hamas uses Palestinian civilians as human shields, and innocent Palestinian families are suffering greatly because of them. Meanwhile, Putin denies Ukraine has or ever had real statehood. He claims the Soviet Union created Ukraine.
The new year begins with the Biden administration managing the same commitments and crises that defined his foreign policy in 2023. Wars in Ukraine and Israel, a simmering conflict with China, as he prepares to campaign for a second term, as Americans, as they always do in election years, turn their attention to problems at home. That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
I think we're in a contest, not with China per se, but a contest with autocrats, autocratic governments around the world, as whether or not democracies can compete with them in the rapidly changing 21st century.
Back on October 19th, in a rare Oval Office address, President Biden tied U.S. support of Israel to his crusade to defend democracy, to resist the rising tide of authoritarianism.
I know these conflicts can seem far away, and it's natural to ask, why does this matter to America? So let me share with you why making sure Israel and Ukraine succeed is vital for America's national security. You know, history has taught us that when terrorists don't pay a price for their terror, when dictators don't pay a price for their aggression, they cause more chaos and death and more destruction. They keep going, and the cost and the threats to America and the world keep rising. So if we don't stop Putin's appetite for power and control in Ukraine, he won't limit himself just to Ukraine.
He did talk a little about Palestinian national aspirations.
I also spoke with President Abbas, the Palestinian Authority, and reiterated that the United States remains committed to the Palestinian people's right to dignity and to self-determination. The actions of Hamas terrorists don't take that right away.
The president usually does not speak about the Palestinian cause as often or in the same way as he has the Ukrainian cause, as Ukraine resists the Russian invasion. But Joe Biden is not the first occupant of the Oval Office who has failed to apply his principles entirely consistently. He has limited his room for maneuver, though, by attaching U.S. power and influence to his global struggle against autocrats. At least that's the implication when he talks about Russia seeking more targets in Eastern Europe.
Putin's already threatened to remind Poland that their Western land was a gift from Russia. One of his top advisors, a former president of Russia, has called Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania Russia's Baltic provinces. These are all NATO allies. For 75 years, NATO has kept peace in Europe and has been the cornerstone of American security. And if Putin attacks a NATO ally, we will defend every inch of NATO which the treaty requires and calls for.
Well, as Daniel Larison writes for ResponsibleStatecraft.org, the U.S. was even more overstretched at the end of 2023 than it was at the beginning. The president committed Washington to support another foreign war in the wake of the October 7 Hamas attack on Israel, while the conflict in Ukraine settled into a stalemate. Although the U.S. was under no obligation to support this war, the president made a point of turning it into one of his signature policies and linked it closely with support for Ukraine in his public rhetoric. Larison goes on to say Biden did not and has not made a compelling case that unconditional support for Israel's campaign is in the best interests of the United States, and the costs of that support have been rising ever since. The risks that the conflict could escalate and spread into other parts of the region have been growing, and so has the risk that the U.S. could become directly involved in a multi-front war. Again, that is Daniel Larison at ResponsibleStatecraft.org, a website of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a non-interventionist think tank. So President Biden, already old and fading, has more security commitments to manage as he prepares to campaign for re-election. And I expect to explore this issue a lot this coming year. Americans will soon start paying attention to the president's domestic record. as they consider who to vote for in November rather than foreign wars where U.S. soldiers aren't fighting and dying. Yet foreign policy will dominate the headlines, or at the very least take up some of our time here. And to discuss it, we have Guy Taylor, Washington Times national security team leader, and Ben Wolfgang, military and foreign affairs correspondent. Guy Taylor, welcome back. Happy New Year, my friend.
Hi, Martin. Happy New Year. I'm so glad to be here.
And Ben Wolfgang, same to you, my friend.
Yeah, Happy New Year. It's a pleasure as always.
You know, they always say as you get older, time goes by faster. You know, I tend to agree because we do this pretty much every January, and it just seems like yesterday that I was talking about Biden's foreign policy. Year one. The crises continue to pile up. So, Guy, we'll start with you. The issue of Ukraine aid is probably going to keep coming up all year long in this election year. How is the administration planning to deal with opposition in Congress to providing Ukraine more aid, more ammo?
It's such a great question, Martin. It's definitely going to dominate the national security discussion in Washington right into this year. I think Biden is going to have to, at some point, confront the fact that Republicans are making increased spending for U.S. border security a condition of more Ukraine aid packages. And we saw that in late December with the NDAA. That there was a compromise to some degree where Republicans got on board and included in the NDAA hundreds of millions in new aid for Ukraine, probably in exchange for earmarked military spending in their own districts or states, in the case of the Senate, and in exchange for language in the NDAA that addresses what many on the right say has been a shift towards wokeness in the military since Biden became commander-in-chief. But the NDAA debate, I think it was instructive on one hand because the amount of Ukraine aid approved was billions lower than what Biden was asking for. And on the other hand, the NDAA didn't address Republican desires for more border security spending. In 2024, there's already talk of a separate $100 billion or so national security spending package. That would be money for Ukraine and Israel and likely also border security. How the debate around that actually shakes out is going to be tied to election politics as well, with Democrats calculating over the next few months whether border security spending would help or hurt Biden's reelection push, right? And as for how Biden will address other bigger picture issues like the fact that several key NATO allies in Western Europe are not coming through on their own promises of certain billions of aid for Ukraine, that's a little bit more delicate because I think President Biden is going to be double taxed with running for president, running for re-election. That could limit his ability to exert influence over the EU on things like energy. Remember, the United States energy sector companies from nuclear to natural gas are making more money off the European market since the severing of EU energy relations with Russia within the context of the Ukraine war. You know, Biden could do a charm offensive with visits to Europe in 2025. But how much time and energy for that will he really have while he's running for re-election?
Yeah, I think you mean 2024, but I got your point.
Sorry, yeah.
And you read my mind there, Guy. Yeah, let's not speed up time too fast here. Yes, there's an EU package of aid that is being held up now by Hungary, but already European states had been falling behind on shipments of military hardware ammo to Ukraine. And, you know, there's also the issue of Republicans are asking this question now. What's the plan here for the war? So, Ben, what is the view, say, from the Pentagon for Ukraine's on-the-ground military prospects in 2024? Sure, the United States can afford to continue to supply Ukraine from now to the end of time, but there has to be some end in sight, maybe? Or is the idea simply to hold the line and prevent more Russian advances in this coming year?
Well, it's a great question, and in some ways, it's going to be the most important question, I think, in 2024 in terms of what happens with the outcome of this war. But Martin, I'm not sure if you're much of a gambler, but I used to do some gambling back in my younger days, and one of the most important and most difficult things to do when you're gambling is to know when you sort of reach the height, when you're at your maximum profit, maximum leverage, and now is the time when I need to walk away. from the blackjack table or from the roulette wheel or what have you. And I think that point was probably sometime in the spring to early summer of 2023 for Ukraine and for the Biden administration. Let's not forget, I remember us having this conversation last January when we talked about how Jake Sullivan, the White House National Security Advisor, had said, our goal is to put Ukraine in the strongest position when they inevitably come to the negotiating table with Russia. That was the view in the early months of this war. This is not going to be a decisive battlefield victory by either side. So we want Ukraine to be in the strongest position possible when they settle this at the negotiating table. Hindsight's 2020, but it sure looks to me like that point was probably somewhere between, say, April to August of last year, because let's not forget, Ukraine had made some pretty significant advances with its initial counteroffensive, but the lines had largely stalled. You had incredible domestic turmoil in Russia, where there was a brief period of time where it looked like, could Vladimir Putin fall victim to a coup from Yevgeny Prigozhin, because the anger certainly among the Wagner Group mercenaries that had played a huge role and still do for the Russian military. So there was a moment where Putin looked vulnerable, where the Russian military had been embarrassed in a lot of ways by the Ukrainians over the first, 9 to 15 months of the war. And that may have been the moment, if your objective was, let's get a deal that is best for Ukraine. That was the moment to strike. Now that moment is past, and it's probably not coming back, unfortunately. Even if the U.S. does sign off on another massive aid package, I think the best you can hope for, Martin, you said it, is to sort of hold the line. How long is the appetite for that going to continue, both in the U.S. and in Europe, politically and in military circles? Because on the ground now, it doesn't look good, and there's not a lot of prospects for it getting better, short of some massive game-changing development.
Yeah, for neither side.
Neither side.
Yeah, neither.
Although it is worth pointing out, Russia is starting to make some advances now, which is incredibly worrying. And folks in the Pentagon are obviously keeping a close eye on that. They're advancing towards Bakhmut. They made some gains there the latter half of last year in December, and they're making advances on other fronts as well. And lest we forget, this was true at the beginning, and maybe some folks have kind of forgotten this because their military has performed so poorly in some aspects. They've got a lot of people and a lot of military ammo equipment to throw at this, a lot more than Ukraine. That's why Ukraine is so desperate to get this U.S. and European aid. Russia's, they've needed some help from Iranian-made drones and North Korean shells and other help from outside of Russia. But they've got a lot of resources to throw at this war for as long as it takes. Ukraine doesn't. And that's why I think the moment to find a way out of this is probably gone.
Such a difficult question, because ultimately it's one for the Ukrainians, although they do rely on outside powers for all their budget is largely financed by outside powers and their military hardware, ammunition, etc. But, to your point, Ben, and Guy as well, if neither side can achieve its military objectives, then what's the point of fighting over and over again for, say, the Donbass? But neither side wants to give in at this point because, understandably, if you're Ukraine, right? You don't want to cede 15 to 20% of your country to an illegal invasion. But I feel like I've been going over that question, that set of circumstances, for the better part of 2 years. Early in the war, it looked like this would just be a war of attrition, and one side has more men and more resources. That's Russia. Go ahead, Guy.
Well, part of what we're seeing with Ukraine is the Biden administration is dropping the ball when it comes to clarifying its narrative on why this war matters so much to greater global security interests and U.S. efforts to maintain stability and not have the Ukraine war be a victory for Russia that is watched very closely by China, by Iran, perhaps by North Korea, but especially China vis-a-vis its desires to take territory in the South China Sea and possibly even try and emulate Russia by running some sort of annexation of Taiwan. And the idea that if Russia is allowed to succeed in some way, the implications for global security are dangerous. And I think that's something that Biden has spoken about to a certain degree, but we don't hear it enough. And I think we're probably going to hear it on the campaign trail. Okay, because again, everything in 2024 is going to begin to go down this vacuum of how are the election politics playing in the United States? Who emerges as the Republican nominee? Is it Donald Trump? Is it one of the others? Nikki Haley, perhaps Ron DeSantis? And all of that will play into his ability. I mean, remember, campaigning for re-election gives him a stage where he can be talking about his successes or pleading, if you would, for why his policy on Ukraine should be better understood by the American public. So that's going to create a challenge for the entire Ukraine policy going forward. And I think it can't be understated.
Yeah, the existential struggle between democracy and autocracy. Ben, one more question about Russia, Ukraine, then we'll move on to Israel, Gaza. Are there disagreements between Kyiv and Washington about how to prosecute the war this year?
The short answer, I think, is yes. From what I'm hearing, I think there are some disagreements. But again, it comes down to a matter of what Ukraine is realistically able to do with the resources that they've got. I mean, I think there are some folks in the Pentagon who would say, well, you could have done this, you could have done that, you could have maybe concentrated your fire here or there, or not done this or focused on that. And at the end of the day, I'm not sure how much any of that really matters, because the broad strokes of this just simply don't change. You have some of the most heavily fortified Russian defensive lines that we've seen in modern times. I mean, since, the last century, 100 years ago, that Russia has fortified in parts of the Donbass and elsewhere in eastern Ukraine. So the Pentagon doesn't have some secret plan that nobody knows about to move Ukrainian men and tanks across massive fields that are filled with landmines and somehow get across these Russian defensive trenches. So, the U.S., had they been making the decisions, probably would have done some things differently here or there, and probably have some different ideas about what to do here or there in 2024. But does that change the broad strokes of what we're talking about here? I really don't think so.
Yeah, I read reports about how American or Western military leaders were unhappy with this move or that move. But at the end of the day, Ukraine does not have air superiority, air supremacy. How are they supposed to fight a wide front counteroffensive? Okay, Israel, Gaza, another crisis the Biden administration is trying to manage here. Guy Taylor, the president, has said that when this horrible war is over, we have to go back to the two-state solution. Well, how? Israel's far-right government opposes a Palestinian state, and when it comes to the Palestinian leadership, no one knows who's going to be in charge in Gaza when the war ends. The Palestinian Authority is discredited. How do you untangle that issue of a two-state solution? I just don't think it's realistic, but...
Yeah, well, it's really premature. First of all, the war between Israel and Hamas has to end. And we're not there. Here we are in January, and we're not sure about where it's going to go. And we don't know what the Israeli government is going to look like over the next year. We can predict that Bibi Netanyahu is going to be in power for a long time, but we don't know for sure. So we also have to look at Biden is under a lot of pressure from Democrats, and particularly the left flank, to stand up for Palestinians and to find a way, because it's just not going to become U.S. policy to support or recognize a state of Palestine at the United Nations. But Biden needs to find a way to project rhetoric to the Arab world that shows that he is in support of the Palestinian people. And the way he's done that, or he did at the end of 2023, was to start pushing the old two-state solution rhetoric again. And that's led to a lot of conversations in the media over at the end of the year about, is that even realistic? I don't know if it is. I think, one, the Israelis have to buy into it, and we don't see any of that from Netanyahu. And then two, let's consider what Netanyahu said at the end of the year. He said that, there could be some Palestinian government role in Gaza once Hamas is destroyed, but it could never have Hamas in it, and would have to also be restructured, which everybody took that to mean it couldn't be the Palestinian Authority government from the West Bank. And then you have to ask the question of whether or not the Palestinian Authority is going to be able to put together some kind of a new government, a post-Mahmoud Abbas government. Remember, about a year, I think it was in 2021, the Palestinians came close to holding an election in the West Bank, but at the end of the day, Abbas canceled it because he was basically afraid he wasn't going to be able to remain in power. Yeah. So there's so many uncertainties on both sides. While we look at that, I think we have to look at the greater regional geopolitics, right? The Israelis are going to finish their campaign against Hamas at some point. And when they do, there becomes this question of whether or not they keep pushing war and that they embrace increased tensions with Hezbollah and possibly get into a wider clash with Hezbollah. The implications of that are important because Saudi Arabia aligns with Israel when it comes to Iran. They both see Iran as a threat, and the possibility of Israel fighting against Iran's most powerful proxy might be something that Riyadh had a little bit of a different posture towards or would agree with. And that's something I think we could see us talking about come February, March, depending on where things go with the current Israel-Hamas war.
You know, Ben, we often talk about differences between presidential administrations, but continuities are always there, and in many ways they're just as important. Biden extended the Trump-era policy of essentially ignoring the Palestinian cause. That's the Abraham Accords. Some people say that policy is now in ashes, but there's also evidence that Arab states want to continue to deal with Israel. And I guess the next big one will be whether the Saudi-Israel normalization talks resume, or when they might resume.
It's really one of the most important questions that we're dealing with when we talk about this, because I think the further we get away from the October 7th attacks, and we knew this at the time, Guy wrote about this, I wrote about this, it was clear at the time, it's become even clearer now, that was at least, if not one of derailing those talks, was if not one of the chief goals, certainly a key byproduct that Hamas and its benefactor, I think Iran, saw coming out of October 7th, is we can derail this potentially for good and end this whole, as they see it, this horrible thing of parts of the Arab world, Saudi Arabia in particular, recognizing Israel. So that is the question that we're going to be grappling with, and the Biden administration is certainly going to be grappling with in 2024. As far as the Palestinians, I want to go back to something that Guy sort of mentioned, what's going to happen, the governance of Gaza going forward. I do think Biden is confronting a really thorny question here. We can get a different governing structure in Gaza because Hamas and its militant leadership doesn't represent the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip. I'm not sure necessarily how true that is. I mean, the election was a long time ago, but they did win an election in 2006. There are polls that were just out in late December showing, I think, 70 some odd percent of folks, sampled in Gaza said that the Hamas attack essentially was the correct thing to do, I think was the wording. You need to grapple with that first. I mean, if you do, in fact, have a population that is largely sympathetic at best or supportive, I guess, at worst, of some of the things Hamas stands for and what they've done, that's an entirely different equation when you're talking about what the other Arab states are going to do vis-a-vis Israel and Hamas and what the future governance of Gaza is going to be.
Yeah, I think you might call it the rally around the flag effect, what's happening right now. I don't think Hamas is popular among Arab leaders across the region, but for the people of Gaza who are now under siege, they see Hamas as a national resistance, national liberation movement, which it is. It is also a terrorist organization or a group that uses terrorism as a tactic. Guy, a final word on the future of the Abraham Accords.
Sure. That's actually exactly what I was going to jump in on. I mean, whether or not the Biden administration pushed the Abraham Accords or picked up and ran with them enough, we can debate that. I think it's important, though, to address that the Abraham Accords, this Trump-era push, this was never about solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That was sort of the whole point of the Abraham Accords. It was about getting Arab powers to recognize that Israel exists as a country and then to achieve economic and cultural exchanges, normalization, diplomatic normalization, and the exchanges between the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Israel, they have not changed or collapsed since Hamas's October 7 attack on Israel.
Right.
And the Saudis have signaled, albeit tepidly or tentatively, that they still very much want to negotiate eventually toward their own normalization with Israel, largely out of a joint security interest and initiative that would align the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis want some kind of parity when it comes to the U.S.-Israel security relationship. They want that kind of parity with a Saudi-U.S. relationship. So I don't think that is off the table. I think that the Hamas-Israel war is hot, and the impact that it's having on realpolitik around the Arab world is hard to understand or measure from Washington. But it doesn't mean that the Abraham Accords, which achieved historic normalizations and recognitions of Israel, is somehow dead. I think that there's very much a possibility that we could be back to, especially if Israel ends up in a bigger clash with Hezbollah, we could be back to the table where Saudi Arabia, the United States, and Israel are talking normalization, even in the wake of this horrific Hamas-Israel war.
Well, as Jared Kushner put it about the Abraham Accords, it was about moving beyond the Palestinian problem or issue. The biggest difference between today and, say, the 1970s, when we're talking about this geopolitical picture, is that the Arab states are almost all, seeking better relations with Israel. That was not the case 50 years ago during, the oil crisis, etc.
After today, and considering all that you've been through in the past year, would you say, Mr. President, that you trust President Xi?
Do I trust you? I trust but verify, as that old saying goes. That's where I am. I think I know the man. I know his modus operandi. We have disagreements. He has a different view than I have on a lot of things, but he's been straight. I don't mean that it's good, bad, or indifferent. It's just been straight. And we, as I said, the thing that I find most assuring is he raised, and I fully agree, that either one of us have any concern, Mr. Ambassador, any concern about anything between our nations or happening in our region, we should pick up the phone and call one another, and we'll take the call.
China. All right, I probably need to spend more time this year talking about China. It's not that I never do episodes about it. What are the most important issues or points of contention between the U.S. and China that the administration is going to have to deal with in 2024?
All right. Well, first of all, in just a couple of weeks here, Taiwan is having its presidential election. And how that plays out, the extent to which China engages in military provocations in the Taiwan Strait in the days perhaps leading up to or right after the election, how the new Taiwan government, presuming it's an extension of the Democratic People Party, DPP rule, which is President Tsai's party, which has been somewhat confrontational toward China over the last 7 years. How does this play out, and is it going to lead to an escalation in tensions between Washington and Beijing that really shapes the relationship over the coming? When Xi Jinping came to California in October to APEC to meet with Joe Biden, we saw a moment of thawing between sort of great power diplomacy. Well, there's tons of differences in tension. Is that moment going to last, or is it going to be derailed right here in January by the Taiwan elections and all that comes with it and posturing from both sides? The next big one is an increase in U.S. military exercises in the Indo-Pacific writ large that are largely about aligning with smaller Western-aligned countries in the region toward countering China's increasing military and naval assertiveness, especially around the South China Sea. We're going to see more of that. And does that lead to more tensions? Remember, during that Biden-Xi summit in California in October, there was the announcement that military-to-military communications, high level, between the U.S. and China would be resumed. They've been frozen by China for more than a year. We still haven't seen them resumed, but do we see possibly some positive overtures from both sides rather than angry posturing and rhetoric and China's accusations that the United States has naval hegemony over the Indo-Pacific or seeks it? And then the last one, I think, on my radar that's really important is what I like to call the microchip war. What we see is the United States, we especially see it with the Biden administration's Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo. She's kind of, if you had to pick one person in the national security element of the administration, the cabinet, who's actually not liked but accepted by hardline Republicans, it would probably be Gina Raimondo, because she's seeking a dramatic increase in funding for the commerce team that actually controls export sanctions of things like microchips and microchip technology to China. China is accused of stealing all kinds of advanced microchip technology and trying to win the artificial intelligence race and weaponize it and all of these things. So how does that play out? Right now, China has tried to kind of put the knife into the Biden administration by limiting graphite exports out of China to the United States. And that's a blow to the Biden administration's climate change, electronic vehicle subsidies push, because graphite is one of the key elements needed for electric vehicle batteries, and China has the biggest reserves of it and exploitation of it in the world at the moment.
Guy mentioned APEC, that is Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. Go ahead, Ben.
the military to military communications, the importance of that to folks inside the Pentagon and the national security, national security circles in Washington cannot be overstated. I mean, the fact that they have been suspended, I think since in the aftermath of the Chinese spy balloon incident last year, have been suspended for nearly a year. That was no small thing. And so getting those back up and running by any measure was a success, I think, for the United States. One thing that I'm curious is sort of the big, because Guy touched on a lot of the specific policy points and they're all valid. I remember us having a conversation last year around this time, Guy, where you mentioned that, you were seeing the signs of what could be a world war alignment growing between China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. I'm going to be watching whether China continues down that path from a big picture perspective. When you see sort of the chaos that we're seeing around the world with the Russia-Ukraine war dragging on throughout 2024, ostensibly, with Iran's proxies in the region, the Houthis, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the chaos that they're fueling in the Middle East. Does any of that impact China's decision-making from a big picture point of view? Do we want to continue to associate ourselves with this block of nations, or do we take a different tack? Maybe the Xi-Biden summit was sort of the first step toward the thawing of relations, if you will, between the U.S. and China. So I guess from the big picture perspective, that's a question that I'm curious to see how it plays out in 2024.
The U.S.-China relationship is the world's most important relationship, and the two countries have just as many reasons to cooperate as they do to be in conflict with one another. And I don't know, Guy, it just seems to me that the China-Russia relationship, how close they are, is often overstated. But you would know better than I.
So that's actually a really good question, Martin. One of the things that we're focused on with the Washington Times National Security Team over the coming months is this so-called axis of authoritarians, the China, Russia, Iran, North Korea alignment, and the extent to which it will be strengthening or weakening in 2024, and what exactly is the tissue.
Yeah, do they coordinate? I don't know.
Sure. So we're looking closely at any high-level, mid-level, low-level meetings between Tehran and Beijing, between Tehran and Moscow. Late in 2023, the Iranian president visited Moscow, and we saw a lot of statements from both the Kremlin and the Iranian government about a growing strategic and military-to-military partnership. We hadn't seen that before. With regard to China specifically, China is really the most powerful in that axis, especially economically, across the so-called dime, the diplomatic, informational, military, and economic arenas. And we're going to be looking at China's role economically, but as well as diplomatically in the Mideast, vis-a-vis the Israel-Palestinian conflict, and in Ukraine, where China has attempted to play some kind of a mediating role and has great interest in Ukrainian resources going forward. Also, Chinese government, I don't want to say meddling, but certainly diplomats from the Balkan region of southeastern Europe call it meddling. There's an increased Chinese presence there. And we've been writing about this kind of Cold War posturing between the United States and China in Bosnia, Serbia. We'll be looking at that. And then I think just considering that Xi Jinping was really absent from the world stage throughout the COVID era. Remember that China's COVID lockdowns, the whole COVID situation in China was just a disaster compared to most of the rest of the world. And we could go right back to the origins of COVID and that whole discussion. But really, Xi coming in October to the United States, it was like he's back on the world stage. And I think everybody's watching. We're going to be watching in 2024 whether or not he's out and about more and whether or not there's a resurgence or a revitalization, so to speak, of Belt and Road that is largely stalled during 2023.
I guess I'm curious to see of a lot of the things that Guy has mentioned specifically, provocations in the South China Sea. We, of course, had the spy balloon. Those are going to be telltale signs of what China wants vis-a-vis with the U.S. China relationship. If that stuff continues, had all these close calls with ships, fighter jets, there are tangible things that we can keep our eye on and use as sort of measuring sticks to figure out, was the Biden-Xi summit, was that actually a turning point, a moment that we look back on and say, okay, that the relationship did take a bit of a turn in the right direction at that moment? Or was it lip service that didn't last because China goes back to flying spy balloons over the mainland United States? Those things are tangible and we can see. So certainly those are the things that the Pentagon is going to be looking at.
Well, it would be in both countries' interests to improve relations. I mean, how many more crises does the Biden administration want to have to manage? But
right.
So, Ben, what other issues are you paying attention to as 2024 unfolds? Doesn't even have to be Biden administration related, anything.
In terms of the military inside the Pentagon, one thing that I'm curious, and again, hindsight's 2020, but I wonder if the conservative war on the woke Pentagon, the woke military, if you will, if that has peaked and is now on the downward trajectory in 2024, because conservative Republicans who had tried to attach a measure to ban drag shows on military bases, to reverse the Pentagon's abortion policy, and just a laundry list of conservative priorities vis-a-vis the woke military got crammed into the House version of the NDAA, were subsequently all taken out, and then those conservative House Republicans basically got steamrolled in the vote in the House. And there was a decisive bipartisan vote to pass an NDAA that had none of that stuff in there. I guess, do we look back and say the high watermark of the conservative war on the woke Pentagon was sometime in 2022, 2023, maybe Tommy Tuberville's stand on the abortion policy comes back to, is looked at as sort of that was the peak of the Republican war against the woke Pentagon, and is that now on the downward trajectory because other, more mainstream, if you want to call them that, somewhat moderate Republicans joined with Democrats past the NDAA. Now, does that turn around if we get a Republican president elected in November? Is there a move to, basically force out anybody that's seen as a woke leader inside the military? Perhaps. So maybe it comes back with a vengeance. But I think right now it looks like that cultural touchstone issue that in a lot of ways defined, the intersection of the military and politics over the past few years may have peaked.
Guy, what are you following that doesn't involve some of the big stuff we've been talking about here?
Sure. Well, I mean, I'm going to put it in the context of China-U.S. Cold War style posturing in parts of the world that are underreported in the U.S. mainstream media, but are on my radar. And the first one is Myanmar. There's a civil war between the military junta and various rebel groups. Which way does that go? China is backing both the junta and various rebels in Myanmar. The U.S. is seen to be backing pro-democracy elements of the rebels. The conflict is nearly unreported in the U.S. mainstream media. And it matters because Myanmar geographically represents China's land bridge to the Indian Ocean. The second one, I think it's Latin America. We had a historic development in Argentina in 2023. They elected Javier Milei, the Trump of Argentina, a hardline populist conservative, who is pegging their currency to the U.S. dollar as we speak. This is an underreported shift in the Western Hemisphere. Again, it matters in that great power posturing context because China has increased economic relations across the hemisphere, and it has a sensitive relationship in Argentina where Beijing has built a deep space station, and that the Pentagon has warned that deep space station could be used to track U.S. satellites, could be weaponized, so to speak. How likely is there to be a U.S.-Argentina partnership that disrupts that? That's on my radar. When it comes to other issues, and really the last thing, they're on our national security team radar going into this year. One is this Pentagon program, Replicator. If you haven't heard of it, there's not much out there about it, but there's going to be more coming. And Replicator is this U.S. Defense Department effort to harness U.S. Commercial, private sector capability to accelerate U.S. military capabilities across all platforms over the coming years. And at the center of it is artificial intelligence and the sort of Cold War style AI race between the U.S. and China. And so Replicator, really, it means a growing convergence between Silicon Valley and the bigger U.S. military industrial complex. I know some people cringe at that term, but that's really the shift we're seeing. And the Pentagon is actually about to hold a big Replicator conference early in the year here. So we're going to be watching that pretty closely because it's got big picture implications for how the U.S. military operates over the coming decade, not just the coming year.
And Guy, no one should cringe at the term military-industrial complex. That's real. It's a real thing. So think about all the work both of you are going to have to do. And then a year from now, we'll be talking about stuff that no one knew was coming. That's the nature of international affairs. Wars will break out or some type of, well, hopefully not another pandemic. Anyway, Happy New Year, fellas.
Martin, thanks so much for having us.
Go to any story at WashingtonTimes.com about national security or foreign policy, military affairs, and you can sign up for Guy and Ben's weekly newsletter, Threat Status, straight to your inbox. On the next episode of History as It Happens, yes, it is an election year, so why not kick off our election coverage, if you will, with Michael Kazin. He has a message for young leftists today, reflecting on 1968. That is next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.